Welcome to the latest episode of Kingston School of Arts Hot Bananas.
Hey guys, who wants to play a game of hot banana? Don't know how to play? Well, here's how you play. You take a banana, you set it on fire, boom, you win. Didn't get it that time, let me show you again. Take banana, set it on fire, done, simple as, how's it fun? Play it with up to 50 of your friends and family, burn a building down, who cares, right? Long as you gotta have banana, watch me again. That wasn't a banana, that was my neighbor's cat, I'm going to jail.
Right, and there we have it. We are here on another episode of Hot Bananas, which is really a playful attempt at revealing the histories and contexts of some creative students. I have with me today three guests, not these three bananas. They'll have their own social object, but I've got three wonderful guests who will talk about the theme of the very contentious social classes. And I will just share my screen to give you a spread of what's going to happen in the next hour. So how this runs is that for the first half hour, our three guests will reveal their social object relating to our theme of the social classes. We call this the signifier, a nice fancy word for it. And after their presentations or just their conversations, we'll leave space for a bit of a banter, impassioned conversations about this subject. And then I might challenge the three of them with a question, so what? Like, what do we do with interesting stories and points of view? Like, can something practical come out of this? Who knows? Our three guests, I have called them the migrant minds for now. They obviously have other job titles and kind of multi-layered identities, but we are joined by Hashi, Liam, and JK. Across the spread, we have obviously UK, we have the Philippines as well, where JK is dialing from. And yes, so that's our lovely guests. Please feel free to wave in your individual screens, and we'll come back to the three of them. Right. And so without further ado, I shall hand it over to you, Hashi, and tell us about the social class, please.
Thank you very much for having us all. Irina, it's a really cool thing to be doing here. So I hope that you guys will really, I can hear music. Is that you dancing in the background, Jake?
Sorry.
There we go. Thank you for having me, and good to meet you virtually, Liam and JK. Thanks for this amazing opportunity. Now, as exactly what Liam was saying, you were quite cryptic about what we were supposed to be talking about today. So the theme of social classes is very broad and very big. So what I thought I would do is I would pick an object which is important to me and is very dear to me, and it's something that I've been working on for many years, and it is my book, which was published late last year. This came out in September in mid-pandemic, and it's a book about social mobility. And given that we are talking about the social classes, I thought that this would be a topic that is worth sharing with you guys and your students. A little bit about me. I was born in Kenya to Somali parents, and my parents who were living in Kenya at the time, my father had died when I was 9, and we came to the UK.
Do I look like somebody who likes to work?
Refugees. And then what this book is really about is what it means to be growing up in London, trying to make it. What does it mean to make it? What does it mean to succeed? How does that work? I grew up in Brent, in the same borough as Rena, some of the most deprived areas in Northwest London, where it is very hard for people to break out of their social groups. It is very hard for people to succeed in a world where It is often a winner takes all mentality. In a world where we were raised exclusively on state benefits, in a world where opportunities are few and far between, the schools are very poor performing, in a world where there is a poverty of ambition in terms of what kind of futures people want, how they want to succeed, and how they want to push forward for those things. And so my book was really about how I came from that background to be a barrister, to be somebody who is working in what's called one of the top professions today, and actually what's happened in my life in that period of time. And the book is really trying to argue from a different perspective, in the sense that when we often hear about social mobility and what it takes to make it, we are often bombarded by messages that say everyone can succeed. Everyone can be whatever they want to be. If only you were willing to work hard enough, if only you weren't willing to be lazy, if only you were willing to just push yourself. And actually what I say in the book is actually I say that's a complete nonsensical way of looking at the world. The world is far more complicated. There are plenty of people who are working extremely hard, but who are not succeeding in the way that they deserve to succeed. And that isn't necessarily their fault. That is a mixture of issues to do with the world that we live in, a mixture of a lack of opportunity, a mixture of a number of factors. And so we should try and be more generous to one another, to try and understand each other's circumstances better, to try and understand what it means to be successful in this world that we live in today, and also just try and see the world in a slightly different way. So for example, not everybody wants to be a lawyer or a doctor or an accountant or one of those tiny jobs that your parents think that you should be, otherwise you're not successful. That if you're not doing these particular social jobs, somehow your life is worth less. Somehow you are worth less. And so part of my thesis for the book was to try and sort of argue that that's just not the way we should see one another, and we need to think about this problem in a much, much broader way. There was then the question of, the book was published in last year, mid-pandemic, in a time when so much was in flux, in a time when we were all obviously in our homes, we were all relying on the public servants to do their jobs. We were relying on doctors and nurses and care home workers, bus drivers, postmen and women, and people who were basically out there on the front line to keep the system going. The paramedics, the policemen and the public servants. We weren't talking about the lawyers then. We weren't talking about the accountants. We weren't talking about these other highfalutin jobs, but we were talking a lot more, as many of you guys will remember. I don't know, JK, what it was like in the Philippines, but here they had this thing on the Thursdays where people would come out and bang pots and pans in a way that kind of shows appreciation for the healthcare workers, showing appreciation for the people who were holding up our NHS. And it's really interesting because what we were saying was, well, we appreciate you. You may not get paid as much as you deserve to get paid, but actually we are surviving as a community, as a society, as a way of life, purely, if not exclusively, down to the fact that you guys are doing your jobs. And that's something that is critical to our society and our well-being. Now, interestingly, at the same time, 3 years ago, when I started writing my book, I started arguing that we should be moving towards a world where we are much more appreciative, much more thoughtful, and much more kinder to the jobs that are done by the nurses, the care workers, and so on and so forth. So it's interesting, and I want to read you a passage. This book, again, I had written it 2.5, 3 years ago, published last year in the middle of the pandemic. But the passage that I'm about to read to you in a way is so ironically perfect for what was happening in the middle of the pandemic. It was perfect for a moment that everybody was out there banging pots and pans on a Thursday night saying we support our healthcare workers. So I'll read you a relatively long passage, which is from a chapter called Imagination, and what is and what it could be. So essentially the thesis of this chapter is to say, in order for you to succeed, in order for you to do well, you have to be able to imagine for yourself a world about which you know nothing. I came from a community and a background where nobody knew what a barrister did, let alone how to be one. And so there is a real need to be imaginative and have that imagination to look into the future and see something that isn't really close to you, that you don't understand, that you can't taste, that you can't feel, that you can't measure, but that you actually work towards and try and achieve within your lifetime. So this chapter is about imagination, but that imagination also requires us, I argue, to give the same weight, measure, and purpose to different jobs, rather than saying a lawyer is socially higher, socially more important than, say, a nurse or a refuse collector or somebody who works in other menial jobs that we may not necessarily respect. So of course, we know that this is the social classes is the theme, but part of my analysis is to say, if we are going to be a more equal society, we need to be more generous towards one another, and we need to reevaluate how we see other people, how we see and value other jobs, how we see one another in terms of what we are worth to each other in society. So I then begin by talking about this being a very much a way forward in the Nordic communities and the Sweden, Norway, and the countries that we often talk about. Could we learn something from the Nordic model? Reducing income inequality, after all, takes some of the pressure, the precarious middle classes, by reducing the financial penalty for downward social mobility. Higher taxes mean better social housing, better schools, more childcare, more libraries, more access to public services, all of which can make a crucial difference to the socially mobile, and higher wages for jobs that are socially important but are poorly remunerated, like those in nursing, the caring professions, teaching, and the emergency services. Pausing there, again, I want to reiterate, I wrote this 2.5, 3 years ago. And those passages about emergency services, caring professions, and the nurses are so prevalent and so important now that, it underscores that issue. A more equal society is one that can give its citizens the space to find their own definition of success, instead of a narrow winner takes all mentality. We could find something that rewards and sees a genuine end in itself, jobs that support others, strengthen our society from within, where compassion and generosity are as valuable qualifications as intelligence and drive. For some, happiness will always be linked with material possessions, flashy cars, higher salaries, and exotic holidays. For some, it will be about power and status. But for others, it will be about happy family, love, and belonging, or about making a difference, creating a change. We could build a society that values all of these outcomes equally, but we will need to use all our imaginations. So I just stop there, Rena. That's my pick for discussing the issue of social classes. And my message is that we should be appreciating all of our people in society, whatever they do. I'll stop there.
Thank you, Hashi. So with all of these, I'm sure Liam and JK have their radars twitching and thinking with thoughts. We shall reserve that for when the two of them have presented their social object or hot banana. Fantastic. So thank you, Hashi, and over to you, Liam.
Yeah, thanks, Serena, and thanks, Hashi. That was a really, felt like a really good way to get into this discussion. And I'm going to start with a social object, which I am wearing right now. It's this baseball cap. It's actually not this baseball cap, but this baseball cap will be indicative of a story I'm about to tell. Because a baseball cap like it almost cost me my first job in the kind of social change sphere back in 2007. It almost got me that job before I got it because I wore it to a job interview. And I clearly seem to have missed some of the social cues that preceded that point, which would have told me that it's not generally very good practice to wear a baseball cap in a job interview. We can unpack that another time, maybe in the discussion. But one of the things that was notable about that, working in a sort of in a social change, like community-based organization, was how often in the time in that job I was reminded of that interview and basically got a version of like, you're lucky to be here. That was a big faux pas, you messed up. Sometimes it would be done in more of a joking way, sometimes it'd be have a little bit more seriousness associated with it, but it was definitely something I was reminded of over and over again as I entered my first sort of like professional experience working in communities. But what I want to talk about today, sort of building off of that, like that anecdote, is about the sort of the idea of how does social change happen and sort of linking that up with some of the social class ideas. How does life improve for big chunks of the population over time? What are the processes through which that happens? And who are the people that make that happen? And I don't want to sort of, this is going to be a bit broad brush and theoretical, and I don't want to just sort of distill any of it in a way that would suggest like this is a black and white, like ultra simplistic thing. But I do want to sort of point at a few patterns that I've seen and experienced. So we come from this question of like, who makes social change happen? There's a kind of quite mainstream narrative on that, which would say that we have politicians who do that. There's politicians that write and change laws. There's politicians that push for having a public health service and push to make sure that corporations can't force you to work 7 days a week in dangerous conditions in more to greater or lesser degrees. So like, that's a fairly mainstream story on how change happens. Politicians do it for us, basically. If that's the case, who are politicians? Now, this is not going to be, there's no great reveal here. I don't know things that most of you don't, but a few baseline stats are that like 19% of MPs in the UK went to Oxbridge versus 1% of the general population. Half of them went to a Russell Group university compared to 11% of the population. 29% of them were privately educated versus 7% of the population. So just like a few top line stats that give a bit of that impression of like, it's not everybody, but there's enough people in this space that have come from quite elite backgrounds, quite a lot of money, and that there's a significant enough chunk to create a culture there that probably makes it harder for others to come into those spaces without it learning how to adopt a lot of the subtle signifiers, the equivalent of not wearing a baseball cap, but probably a lot more complex than that. I don't really understand it, but a lot of those things in order to enter those spaces. But that's like a really mainstream narrative. Politicians create change. If we look at it slightly more broadly, what if we look at some of the professions like journalism, people who like write the stories that shape public opinion in one way or another? We'd find that 44% of newspaper columnists in the UK were Oxbridge graduates. If we looked into the legal system, following on from some of Hashi's description, 52% of judges were privately schooled and then went to Oxford, which ties in that element of like any meritocracy you might associate with the university system. Private school is definitely a pretty strong indication you've come from wealth. And then looking into the private sector, 34% of chairs of FTSE 350 companies have also been privately schooled. So again, another one of these indications that people in these positions of power in society have come from very disproportionately from relatively like wealthy backgrounds. This isn't anything major and new that I'm highlighting here. This is something that probably most of us know in a pretty intuitive way. It's not absolute, it's not 100% of all the people in these institutions, but it's a pretty significant factor in terms of creating that collective culture. And that collective culture being one of the benchmarks for people coming into it. How easily do you adapt to and take on the social cues that make that space what it is? So like I said, there's going to be a meritocracy argument some might make around like Oxbridge colleges. These are the best universities around. People who make it there because they're smarts. I think the private school one is, like I said, a bit more clear cut, that it's much stronger an indicator that you've come from a particular place, and is a strong indicator that then you will go on to another place. And regardless of the meritocracy arguments, I think the core piece I want to get through in that analysis is that when you have a group that's dominated by any particular group in any space, it's going to be lacking perspective. If you have a whole bunch of people who've never lived in a council house, never been on benefits, never like not known where their next meal is coming from, there's some really important perspectives that are going to be missing in all of those spaces. And even if there's people in them who individually who've had some of those experiences, how are those experiences going to translate if there's all the pressures to sort of conform to a dominant group culture in those spaces? So basically, like this thing that's been talked about in a range of different terrains, but that the more homogenous a group is, the less likely it is to be able to represent and bring in a range of other perspectives. Pretty straightforward. I want to look in this, taking it back to the baseball cap story. Like, how does this apply in the world of social change? And I kind of mean that in the broadest sense, from sort of NGOs and some more kind of progressive or radical charities to kind of radical direct action activist groups, that kind of thing, because there's some quite consistent patterns I've seen in those spaces as well. It might not be the same degree of Oxbridge proportion in those spaces, but there's definitely quite a high degree of privilege, I would say, in a broad sense. And sometimes that will have to do with class, but class is always overlapping and intersecting with race, migration status, language, a whole range of other things which all feed into and overlap with and diverge, but often overlap with each other in different ways. And so one of the things I found in the last 15 or so years working and organizing in activist spaces, community spaces, campaigning organizations, is that there is a quite strong dominance of often like quite privileged, often quite white middle class folks in leadership positions in these spaces. And I think for the same reasons that we might critique the problems with like having so many similar folks in newspaper offices, in the House of Lords, the House of Commons, we need to be able to be critical of that when it's happening in spaces, social justice spaces, because these are also spaces where like they are part of the picture of how social change happens. So this is a little less intuitive than like those who've come from backgrounds of power. It makes sense that they would end up in places of power, like as an MP, as a leading columnist in a newspaper, these kinds of jobs. These are power positions you might expect. But I think starting to see how the world of social change actually mirrors and reflects some of that is quite an important one in terms of thinking about how we bring about and how social change happens. Much like that description of these other spaces, when you have spaces that are working to create change, working to bring about change in communities that are not reflective of those communities, when the people who are most affected are often not in the rooms making decisions, developing strategies, deciding on tactics, there are big implications of that. There's things that are missed, but as much as anything, there's a lack of investment often in the solutions that arise, because the people who are in theory going to benefit from them are often not invested in them. If they haven't been a part of fighting for them, creating them, deciding them, pushing them, like even if you get a policy change around something that might affect a community in a positive way, 4 years later, the government might change, and you could very well end up in a position where that just gets rolled back. And if there's going to be anyone to fight for it, it often comes down to, are the folks most affected going to be invested enough in that particular change to fight for that change? I think one of the big reasons for this is how often, and I think this is stronger in the NGO world, but also happens in kind of more grassroots social movements, these are groups that are set up to influence the existing systems of power. These are groups that they want to influence MPs to put certain changes into draft laws. They want to build legal cases to create precedents on different things. They want to get journalists writing about the issues in a way that is sympathetic to the cause. All of this is built on the idea of how do we influence existing systems of power. The problem with this as an approach to understanding change, and I don't want to say it's like a blanket problem, but I think when it's not challenged, the big problem that can arise from it is that when you try and create systems to influence existing systems of power, you end up looking a lot like those systems a lot of the time. You end up starting to create parallels where you're like, if we want to get a meeting with this MP, who's going to be able to go and schmooze with them well at this House of Commons like drinks event? If we want to get in with this journalist, do we know anyone who went to college with them at one of those Oxbridge colleges? Do we know the language to put in our press release that's likely to connect with someone of a similar background? And so a lot of the systems that are designed to influence and progressively change the systems of existing power also end up being much more familiar and comfortable to folks who come from some elements of that power base themselves. And also, and I think the extension of that end up being quite excluding at times to those who have come from outside of those spaces and might show up at a job interview in a baseball cap, for example. And this is like, I don't want to like focus on this too much. This is a very trivial example of it compared to how a lot of people experience that kind of exclusion. I did get that job, which does say a lot about other levels of privilege I might be able to bring to a situation. But that question of how do we envisage change happening? Is it through influencing those existing systems of power? Is it through being able to say, if we can get the right law passed, if we can set that legal precedent, if we can change the narrative in the media, we will create the change we want? Or is it through something alternative? And I don't want to try and offer anything definitive here, but I think there is something in reimagining power as a way of reimagining social classes, which is, what is the kind of power that we can create together versus what is the kind of power that can be wielded over us? And maybe if we're lucky, we can influence it to be a bit better. And maybe in the discussion, we'll have a chance to get into that. It feels like probably a bit of a broader thing to get into from here. But I think that's the question that I've been grappling with in a lot of the organizing spaces I've been in recent years, is what are the forms of power that are not contingent on trying to look like, act like, behave like the systems of power we already have? What are the things that we can do in our communities together with one another in relationship to be able to create a form of power that helps us meet our needs and improve our situations? So I will leave it there at that point. And I'm really looking forward to the discussion and where we go with this.
Yeah. Thank you, Liam, for that second installment. If I had a hat, I would tip it towards you. And so to pass the cap on to our third guest, JK, over to you.
Thank you, Liam and Hashi. Thank you. It's so good listening to both of you. And okay, so hi, I'm JK. I'll be doing a lot of stream of consciousness conversation or exchange with everybody. But I'd like to tell you that I am from Manila in the Philippines. It's currently at this time I'm 8 hours ahead, I guess. Yeah. So if you hear the word Filipino, what are the first 3 things that will come to mind? maybe nothing, maybe a nurse in the hospitals, or perhaps if I go to Japan, when you say Filipino, they'll think about Filipino entertainers or Filipino bananas. So just like this, oh, I turned it to a banana. Oh, hi there. I just feel it feels so good to be invited here in hot bananas. That's just my easy way of finding connection with everybody because there's so much context that I need to unpack. But I trust that you seek for these points of connection and seek for context. But I'm a performance maker, so a lot of my work is about materializing ideas. But recently, I've been thinking a lot about pre-enacting possible futures. So I'm going to share with you an object that is, I don't know if it's too visceral or it's just right, but here it is. I'll share a photo. As a performance maker, I work a lot in disaster areas, um, doing psychological first aids, working with teachers and young people. Do you see my PowerPoint? Yeah. So there. Okay. This is a formula. Before I show my object, this is a formula that I've been thinking a lot about the past few years. They say disaster response is the formula for response is hazard times vulnerability over capacity. So in times of disaster, just like we have a pandemic, poverty as disaster, or in cases of war or conflict, I always think about, of course, mapping the vulnerabilities and hazards, but more importantly, what capacities we need to build. So I'll just park this idea and we'll go back to this. So we talk about social classes. I won't talk about those of high social classes from the Philippines. You can Google them. They've got lots of shoes, wonderful paintings in their houses, very rich. So this is the object that I want to show you. This is a sofa. This was in, I took this in November after a typhoon hit this region. So I will zoom out a little bit. So this fa was from a flooded house. So this is the bigger picture. This sofa, I found it at the road near a river wall. So on the left is a river wall. At the backdrop is a mountain. That's a mountain range. So this sofa is originally inside a house, of course, but because of the rain, there was flooding and it went as high as 2 stories. It went 2 stories high, and children and and adults were swimming to save their lives at that time. No? So I'll zoom up a little bit. So at the back of the seawall, this is the river. So this is a river that went really high and it spilled. But beside this river are houses. I These are the houses that was drowned during the flood. These people are urban poor, people from urban poor communities in the city, and they were relocated to what we call now death zones. And these death zones, you know that it's not livable, but you need to take them away from the city um, so that their land or the lands where they squat or where they stay can be taken over and where we can build more malls, shopping malls. Um, so so that's why they're relocated. So the city can make use of this land. But they were relocated beside the river. And let's zoom up a little bit. This is the photo. Let's go to the mountain. I think I want to show the mountain a little bit more. So this is part of the Sierra Madre. It's a mountain range. And on that mountain, there was quarrying. So big mining companies, I don't know if it's US company or European company that was doing a lot of quarrying in that land, no? So the flooding is not just caused by it's not caused by just the heavy downpour of rain. There's also soil erosion. It's also mismanagement and displacement of a lot of people, relocating them in these spaces. Um, so when I so this is, I don't know if this is like the lowest of, or if we have like the lowest depths of our social classes. Um, so I go back to this image. Recently, I've been thinking a lot about the climate crisis. But I always say that aside from the climate crisis, when it hits these social classes, it's not just about it's very much interconnected. The problem with land, the problem with displacement of indigenous people living in that mountain range, so that we can do quarrying. It's also the lack of education of people. Also, no, that we don't know how to manage resources. Just because we do not own the land, so you see, it also became like a garbage mountain. So beside the sofa, so near the sofa, there's also like a piles of mountain garbage. Um, so I'm thinking a lot about climate crisis and also a cultural crisis. We look at culture as something that's dynamic, that we're constantly changing. What we have now is a culture of impunity. There's a culture of apathy, and many more. So um, just recently, on other part of this mountain range, on the other side of this mountain range, there is this beautiful view of a lake, then leading to the ocean. No, and here, um, people do not own the land, but they stay there. People just put up their homes and build communities. There's also a waterfalls. The water is this is a natural resource that is open to a lot of people. What is my point? Pretty soon, because there's also a new relocation area, new housing projects for the urban poor that are being relocated in these spaces. Garbage is also piling, but at the same time, there's a lot of injustices also in the community. But how, how do we deal with that? No, so we have a lot of challenges in education. First of all, um, these lands are indigenous people's lands that are um, being sold by the government, and where they put people and displace people, and so they create that web of displacement. At the same time, when you're getting relocated, you don't have any livelihood. You do not own the land, and so you do not care for the land. So see, this is a banana, a banana plantation in that mountain range. But the only thing that's different from this banana trees is that the bananas that are from these trees are not being sold or exported overseas. These are being consumed freely by the people in that land. So I do not know what points of connection I can make with this with these wanderings. But um, being in these spaces, when you are surrounded by 360 degrees of poverty and disaster and destruction, it's really challenging to imagine that there is a better possible future for everyone. We do not even go to, there, we don't have that much political education to discuss about inequalities. I think many years of colonization, we managed to just accept, um, uh, we just managed to accept this social divides among people. So yeah, and so I think as someone working as a performance maker, the collective imagination is something that has to be that has to be brewed So I was asking a while ago, like what capacity shall we build with the people so that they can see and they can acknowledge that there is this system in place that stops people from getting the resources that they need and even their rights. You know? So yeah, I'll just end there for now because I will just go on and on.
Thank you, JK. This is now exciting because now the floor is over to the three of you to let loose your thoughts, opinions, and to caveat these sessions is not to give a summative totality of the theme, but these are definitely three different avenues for students and also for us to explore. So let's have a conversation. So Liam, Hashi, and JK, over to you.
Could I just pick up the points that Liam was making, which I thought was really, really important about the power of the culture that's created by a particular group of people, because that's something that I've explored as well, Liam, and is in the book that I wrote, and I spent quite a bit of time. And it's not just about, you know, baseball caps or anything like that, but I think using a baseball cap is a really powerful way of doing it, because it can be about the kind of suit you're wearing. It can be about a hoodie. I've been in trouble for wearing my hoodie, so it can be a whole host of things. But my question to you though, Liam, is this. I mentor a lot of young people, and I always tell them, listen, if you're going to go for a job interview, you need to understand that you're going into an environment that already has a culture and a power structure that doesn't favor you. You are going in there pretty much at a disadvantage. So you need to do something to ensure that not only are you good at the job and that you are competent and that you're qualified enough to be there, but you then have to also play a role in neutralizing these people's prejudices. And that involves your clothes. I know that from experience. Hashi, Mohamed, I know that 40% of the time, if you have a foreign name in the UK, your CV is more likely to go in the bin. People get judged on their accents. So I often wonder and feel guilty though, should I be giving that kind of advice? Or should we be challenging that environment? And should that be for the individual or should that be for society? So I wonder what your thoughts were on that, Liam.
Thanks, Hashi. I think it is a really good question, and thanks for drawing some of those links together. I mean, I think it's one of those things that's both so personal and so political that there's no definitive answer around it. I guess my instinct with it is recognizing that like we all end up going into spaces out of necessity that are not built for us in one way or another, and there's the acknowledgement of when we have to go into those spaces because we need to pay our rent, the sacrifices and challenges that we need to make, and different people will need to make those differently in lots of different ways. And that in itself, I think, is a form of how oppression plays out. And then I think there's the sort of the question of how do we challenge those systems so they're not continually reinforcing themselves, and you get the sort of the respectability politics of like separating out people of different races or classes or different backgrounds based on like this is one of the good ones, and how that ends up actively working against so many other people as well. And so I think it is just a really tense question, because the same kinds of things that can kind of get you in the door in a lot of spaces are the same things that can make it harder for the next person to get in the door. And so like, I don't want to say there's a definitive. I think it is just a really hard balance that having systems of inequality like we have, like force people to grapple with and make compromises on every day. But I think, yeah, I think it's sort of, from my perspective, it's kind of, it's never going to be the thing that we're able to challenge completely on our own. And therefore, like, what are the collective structures, the collective ways of organizing where we can create some kind of alternative form of power, like whether that's local businesses in a community that can provide employment that doesn't require people to sort of like like subsume so many parts of who they are in order to get in the door, or whether that's creating alternatives that stop some of the wider systems of violence. Like if you haven't been able to access employment because of all of those forms of discrimination, like do you have a community that will keep you in your home when the bailiffs come? Like there's those kinds of systems. So like that's where I focus a lot of my energy, at least.
And I'd love to know how this plays out in Manila and the Philippines as well. But I just thought I'd add to that. In my profession as a barrister, one of the things that I've drawn attention to is exactly as you've already identified, the Oxbridge education of the politicians, the Russell Group way of looking at things. One of the things I drew attention to was, if you went to a public school, paid all this money to be in a public school, and you were going then from there to Oxbridge to then becoming a barrister, I've shown in a number of articles that I've written how much those three worlds pretty much mirror one another. I mean, like scarily so. And so you go from, say, Eton to Oxford to the bar, the Honourable Society of Lincoln's Inn, and then you become a judge. You've pretty much gone through that whole thing of your life without really having come across people like you and me in the communities that we grew up, people who having to use the criminal justice system, people who have to deal with police brutality, and then you're then passing judgment on these people. And so what I talk about is as I've done is I've participated in this system, and in some ways I'm complicit in it now because I've had to succeed within it. But now that I'm inside, the way I square that circle that you're saying, that the way I deal with that tension is I say, well, now I'm in it, but I'm still going to call it out and tell you guys, you need to understand that all the structures that you guys have in place actively exclude people like me. That's why I actually called the book People Like Us, right? It actively excludes people like me. So what are we actively doing to deal with that, to ensure that we are then capturing as much talent as possible, regardless of the background that they're from? So anyway, JK, to you, how do these things play out? I mean, of course, I can imagine for you as well, when you were talking about those images and the people whose homes are being flooded, that's another example of people whose social communities are building homes that can't withstand those things. I bet the nice affluent areas of Manila are not being flooded like that.
Yeah. There's a lot of barrier not to social justice and to access, especially, for example, it's as simple as our laws are in English. And for us to understand inequality or the conversation about inequality, we have to access this knowledge, this information in another language, and that is how it plays. So there's a lot of steps, a lot of barriers that were heavily what they call that, embodied or even internalized even before we go to a critical discourse. So even participation. So but for I come from pretty much a middle class or lower middle class family. um I think that's our way out, of the social classes we're born into, is to be educated, and or to be very talented, or and go abroad or go somewhere else and earn a living. So so those things, no, we have a lot of internalized in what do they call that? We have internalized slavery, or even that small brown man syndrome that we call. We have that you just take, people in communities just take it as it is. Except for some that have like big ambitions, but they end up like replicating the system once they get hold of power. So I think in organizations also that's a challenge, to participate. But how, in my experience, it's one thing to participate and to call out this power dynamics, but sometimes it also works when you create an alternative way of coming together, or alternative community ways, and then when people see that working, then that's the only time that they start supporting it or resisting it. So I work those ways.
I'll just chime in with Hashi's like question about say,
Mm.
so far th- having to unpack social classes is obviously an ongoing endeavor, literally, metaphorically. And so we're covering, like class as status, as power, the post-colonial identity, color as class, and aesthetics of what you're wearing. And the answer in terms of the climate change question is you would think that in some parts, yes, the wealthier classes are safe from climate change, and yet they're not. So I grew up in an upper class, that's political family, gated communities, had servants. Some of my members of family still have servants, and there is also a sense that they're not quite absolved, because then I think it includes an even higher elite to really escape that. That to what extent physically, in terms of land, can you actually avoid the wrath of nature? And that it just goes to prove how in Hollywood, right, with the fires, even the wealthiest were not saved from the wrath of nature.
Where even right now, Texas, that's having problems with its power. Texas is supposed to be the Lone Star state that's supposed to be very rich, but even they are struggling. But everybody will come to that. But Jackie, can I ask you about? You said something about one ways of succeeding is if you're talented and you work hard and education, basically, right? But
Hmm.
we also know that a lot of people are very talented, a lot of people work very hard, and they still struggle, right? We have to look at
Mhm.
that as a society too, right?
Mhm. Yeah. Yeah. I'm I'm reflecting on this because I this is the way I always contextualize is that it's a very performative country. We perform all this uh we are performing 24/7 in a way. Yeah, that's why I think the labor that we export,
And that's what I wondered, like
we
how
export
much, if you go
yeah.
to the Philippines, if you go to Dubai, you come to any NHS hospital, like the labor that the Philippines exports is just phenomenal. Like, what is it about the culture there that means that anyone who wants to do something basically just says, I need to get out of here?
I am going to tag Liam
Mm.
because there is as a representative, and I think you have lots of experience in the NGO sector, the idea of like the white man savior, right? That class, color as class, nationality as class, and the power dynamics. I was explaining to the students, it is unbelievable how the British Empire have a lot to answer for. Like empire and its vast historical legacy means that class is still anchored to not just jobs and identities, but right, like the having to compete with first world. What is a first world nation? And that even in the first world, you have the substrata of class, but the global classes, they're still the first world versus developing nations and having to play catch up. So Liam, thoughts?
I mean, I feel like I'm from Canada and have moved to the UK, and I'm probably not as well placed as like JK and Hashi probably both have a lot more experiences of some of those movements between those spaces. Like I yeah, I would probably hand over to you two to be able to speak to some of those particular power dynamics, because like between Canada and the UK, like I have a ton of global privilege in those senses that like I haven't had to move between those spaces in the same ways at all, and particularly whiteness and to nationality and to global North countries. So yeah, I feel like both from what you've both described, you both have a lot more experiences that might tap into that.
JK, do you want to say something on that? I mean, I think I'm interested in how come Filipinos and Filipinas are basically running the world.
That's nice. Yeah. Labor is our biggest export. We don't have industries. We don't have local industries. It's also because of our being colonized with the Americans. So our education, for example, we've been providing we've been exporting labor since the 1900s. Farmers for the United States, in Hawaii and Guam, or steel factory workers in the US. And then the next wave eventually became about the care labor, the caregiving labor, so care work, and then the entertainment work. I think because the resources of the natural resources we have does not benefit the people here. So for example, I was talking about the bananas. We're the top exporter of bananas, but the farmer who planted these nice looking bananas that you'll see in top Japanese supermarkets or even in the UK, and I saw that this expensive bananas, the farmers who planted them cannot even afford buying that banana in the same plantation where it was planted. So that's the inequality there. No, yeah. So but also that's why they also tailor fit. It was our education was tailor fit for us to talk in English, and so that we can leave and so that we can accommodate working in hospitals. But at the same time, now we're also doing call centers. There's a lot of call center work in the Philippines where it's easy for us to imitate accents. We pretend we're Americans or Europeans at times. Yeah, so labor is cheap, and it's easy to export. But the overseas Filipino workers are bringing a lot of money also to the economy. So that's the exchange, no? But not necessarily. You do not feel this taxes translated to social services. We don't have healthcare. We don't have healthcare systems. We do not have retirement plans, or we don't have housing plans. We don't have those things.
Yeah, I think JK, that was probably the caption. Labor is cheap. And that talks volumes, literally, like there are books about this. I want to tag the three of you, like the idea of like with Liam representing with a baseball cap. I was amused because Hashi has to wear a headpiece as well to mark his status as barrister, and JK, the many hats you have to wear as a performer. The idea of, I'm gonna just make it playful, like we know about Harry Potter, and there's the sorting hat that determines what house you're in, that dictates your destiny. And I love that it's about magic because it's the idea of power, the power you wield to manifest and make life happen, like what you imagine and make it come true. And so I will share your three objects because it does help to show the differences and commonalities. Is right. So we have in our selection a book, a cap, the sofa, among some trash, and how do we? I think how do we tackle, elevate, and also change the class question, right? So much of it has been dominated by Marx and rich versus poor, and like white versus black, brown, whatever, right? The binaries. And what we're clearly unpacking here is that it is messy. It's not a binary, a flat this or that. But I think what you've captured, all three of you, is the power of imagination, to imagine yourself in spaces and roles that maybe you wouldn't have been designated accordingly. So I was thinking about this. So if I put these three objects in a blender, I might just get a story, the fairy tale book story of the emperor with no clothes. And because obviously, like, Liam was talking about how our clothing, looking the part, is part of the roles we play. JK, as theater, right? You have to adorn yourself with a costume, and yet we have, without trying, we already have certain costumes, our skin, our looks, our nose, etc. And so yeah, so I was thinking this idea of like how our imaginations could question the current realities that are illusions, that so much of what we have in place, the rules, the hierarchy, is made up. It's, I'm gonna swear, it's effing made up, right? And yet people uphold that projected imagination, that projected kind of beliefs that, oh yeah, like trying to just live out and role play stuff. So this is not a solution. It's just more, the question really is for the three of us, but also to students and would-be listeners here, is where do we take that imagination and challenge perceptions, challenge what may not be real, and what isn't set in stone, I guess. So yeah, just like some powerful signifiers there. And yeah, I think Hashi said squaring that circle. And Liam, um, I think your cap in esoteric studies, for example, it might be a fool's cap, right? It's like a certain standing that, oh, it's not, you're not to be treated seriously. And yet, what is a crown but just a fancy cap or a fancy hat?
I might jump in on the imagination theme because it was something I sort of saw as a bit of a connection between these. And I think it's one of those ones that's interesting to me because all the things that everyone has said about the need when you're in a position where everything in life has told you that is who you are and that's where you belong and that's where you're going to spend the rest of your life. Imagination is obviously a really crucial piece of coming through that. And also it's such an individualizing way of looking at these wider social structures that are holding all these things in place. And just in that same way that, like, we've sort of talked, like Hashi and JK have both sort of talked about this sort of the mythology around the like work hard and succeed kind of thing. There's this dichotomy that like I sometimes struggle with of like encouraging the imagination to see other possibilities without losing sight of the structural factors that will work very hard to crush you over and over again, and how to hold those things in balance. And I'd just be really like keen to hear from both of you as to some of your experiences of how do you hold those things.
I mean, for me, I agree with you actually when you were starting out earlier about meritocracy, because actually the myth, I call it the myth of meritocracy, because it's a complete myth. This idea that if you think about the world that we live in today, the world today remunerates and rewards somebody like LeBron James exceptionally well. But had LeBron James been born in 1902, he'd be a different kind of guy doing something completely different. And so many of us are often lacking the humility to understand that if we are in a very successful place and we're doing well in life, we often discount that the amount of luck that you have in that. There's a really good professor called Robert Frank, who is a professor at Cornell University, who's written a book on the myth of meritocracy. And he has this great phrase where he says, never mention luck in the presence of self-made men. Because, and the way he explains that is, he says, if you think about when you're cycling, I don't know if you guys cycle, if you're riding a bicycle and you're cycling up a hill and you're going up that hill, you are pushing yourself, your back, your legs, everything is really struggling to get that bike up the hill. And you are there struggling. That's an example of bad luck. Bad luck. It's there, it's in your face, you feel it, it's visceral. But the moment you take a left or right hand corner, and now you're going downhill in your bike, you're pedaling down that bike downhill with the wind in your back. It's really interesting the way our brains work, in that now that you've got the incline assisting you, you've got the wind in your back, and you're pedaling a lot less harder. In your mind, you're much more likely to think, it's me who's doing this. It's all me. I have no one helping me, because the assistance you have is almost invisible. Whereas when you're going up the hill, the struggle is not invisible because you're feeling it. With every single pedal, you're feeling it. So when you have bad luck, it's in your face, it's assaulting you. When you have good luck, you're much more likely to discount it. And so for me, when you think about the biggest, richest man in the world today, who is now providing us all with Amazon deliveries every day, everybody talks about, if you Google Amazon startup right now, after you finish this call, you'll see there's a picture of a basement or some garage where Amazon was founded. And it gives you this, all the startups in Silicon Valley always tell you about how they all started out in a basement. When you read the footprint, and you read the footprint with somebody like Jeff Bezos, you'll discover that in 1991 or 1990, whenever it was he founded it, his parents gave him $250,000 cash, interest-free, just like that, to start up his business. Now, don't get me wrong. The guy is talented enough. He did a lot of work. He worked hard. He hit the right time. He hit the right moment. The internet picked up, all of that. But I'm sorry, if you started out with $250,000 just like that, that is not a story of meritocracy. That is not a story of simple success, of hard work. And the final thing I'd say about that is this. When you tell that story to the world and you make it seem like your success was born out of that kind of environment, I believe what you do is you set up a lot of people for failure. Because what you do is you are telling an incomplete and therefore irresponsible story about success. Because then everyone who reads that, who doesn't read the small print, who doesn't understand the bigger picture, who rarely appreciates the role of luck, will then try and succeed, perhaps face a few stumbling blocks, perhaps fail. And what will they conclude? They will simply conclude that it's my fault. I'm not good enough. I'm not working hard enough. I'm not willing to succeed. And that is the danger of the world that we live in today, is that it just simply puts these binary, ridiculous notions and makes it seem like you're living in a meritocratic society. The world is neutral and you just have to play with it. And that is so dangerous. It's unhelpful, and we have to stop it. I'm going to stop there. Sorry, I could keep going.
Yeah, thanks, Hashi. JK, I think Liam wants to hear your thoughts, so I'm just going to do a provocation. In the Philippines, one of our heroes, right? This notion of luck and hard work. I also know it has a wealthy patron and a political patron, is Manny Pacquiao, the boxer, right? The rags to riches, I am but a poor boy, though my story seldom told. So JK, if you'd like to just use that as an avenue of this notion of working hard, the poor to wealthy and powerful story.
Oh, it's difficult, no? You know what adds value to people's labor? When there's an international what's this? When there is a validation from an international standpoint. So when you're participating, so because it's that's why we came up with the idea of world class. So that to be world class is to be able to, be in conversation with the world or you can be known in the world. So it adds to your value. Yeah. I'm actually, I think just going back to Liam's question a while ago, I'm really thinking about currencies, and valuation. What new currencies this? So if it's I'm thinking like during this pandemic, no, and you were saying that even the rich are also affected, blah blah blah. Yeah. But does shared vulnerabilities create new solidarities? And a new imagination across social classes. But for now, I think I'm just curious, like, how does it work out there? Here it just really start. It's very steep. The gap is very high. It's we have 1% rich, 70% are from agricultural lands or doing that. So we have a lot of so that's the population now. So I'm is there a way for people to rethink currencies and valuation and exchanges? But of course, it's a radical way to think about not participating in this capital exchanges. So what's in it for these communities? We also have this idea of, like, your regenerative livelihoods and regenerative ways of being in communities, etc. These are small prototypes or small dents to systems that's been in place for centuries. So but it's still, I think years ago, I'm thinking about I've been talking a lot about rehearsing possibilities or enacting or rehearsing the future. But I think right now we just have to do it. I think you just have to do it now. There's no rehearsal. But what is its form? What is its materiality? What is its viscerality? And how it can be translated in different currencies.
Wow. I think I'm going to end it there with that is a call to action. And yes, we can talk about this at length. And it's just been a really rich discussion. I'm most appreciative of the three of you giving your time and experience and conversations. Thank you, Hashi. Thank you, Liam. Thank you, JK. That wraps up the Hot Bananas episodes on a very contentious social class. This is an invitation to unpack that box, and the call to action of, like, how do we imagine better options for us all?
Thank you for organizing it as well, Rena. So good to meet you,
Yeah.
JK and Liam.
Really good to meet you both.
Thank
Rena.
you.